Hi everyone, welcome to lecture number 32, the second lecture on labor market discrimination. In our last lecture, we discussed about wage discrimination. We discussed how differences in earnings and employment opportunities may arise even among equally skilled workers employed in the same job in the same firm simply because of the worker's race, gender, national origin, sexual orientation or other certain irrelevant characteristics. These differences are often attributed to the labor market as discrimination. So, this discrimination occurs when the participants in the marketplace take into account such factors like race, sex, country of origin when they are making this economic exchanges, the trade-off. So, for example, as we discussed, employers might care about the gender of the workers they hire. So, this could be lead to a kind of employers discrimination. Sometimes it happens that employees might be cornered about the race of their co-workers. So, this kind of discrimination may lead to employees discrimination or workers discrimination. Sometimes discrimination may happen in the form of customers discrimination, like customers might take into account the race and the gender of the seller. So, in this lecture we will discuss about the economic discrimination, the discrimination coefficient. The economics of discrimination is a groundbreaking work done by economist Gary Becker in the year 1957. The book this Economics of Discrimination by Becker applies economic analysis to the study of discrimination, challenging the traditional sociological and psychological explanations were there before that. So, this work is a very seminal work to understand the economics of discrimination in the labor market. Particularly, Becker's work laid the foundation of the economic analysis of discrimination and has had a profound influence on the field of labor economics and related disciplines. So, let us discuss some of the key concepts and the insights from this economics of discrimination founded by Gary Becker. The first and foremost concept is the human capital theory. Becker argues that discrimination is inefficient and it is costly because it disregards the individual's productivity and potential contribution to the economy. So, whenever there is some kind of discrimination happens, then the individual's productivity and potential is not considered or not addressed properly. So, he emphasizes that the importance of human capital like education, skill, experience, these are the factors that determine the economic outcome of the individuals. So, discrimination that prevents certain groups from fully developing and utilizing their human capital is seen as a detrimental to the economic efficiency. So, whenever there is some kind of discrimination happens in the economy, then it leads to inefficient allocation of the resources. Further, Becker distinguishes between two types of discrimination. One is the taste based discrimination, second is the statistical discrimination. So, Becker introduced this taste based discrimination. He says that this taste based discrimination occurs when individuals or the firms have a preference for or against certain groups based on irrational or prejudiced or biased attributes or attitudes. So, Becker acknowledged that this taste based discrimination it exists, but in a competitive forces, in a competitive market, so competitive forces demand and supply tends to erode such discrimination over time. Further, he introduced the concept of this statistical discrimination. In statistical discrimination, he says that to measure unobservable characteristics like productivity and reliability, the firms and the individuals they use certain observable characteristics like race, gender, age. So, when these kind of proxies are used to understand the economic transactions, then the statistical discrimination happens. So, the statistical discrimination may arise when there is imperfect information or when it is costly to obtain certain information about the individuals. Further, while considering the market competition and the discrimination, Becker argues that competitive markets tends to mitigate discrimination over time by penalizing the firms that engage in discriminatory practices. So, in a competitive market, discriminating against qualified individuals based on certain irrelevant characteristics. So, this discrimination imposes certain costs on the firm in the form of lost profits. So, in a competitive market, over the time, the firms that discriminate are likely to be out competed because they are going to lose certain profit. So, in that case, this discrimination may wash out over a period of time in a competitive environment. So, over time firms that discriminates are likely to be over competed by those who do not take into consideration any kind of discrimination, and they go with the productivity and merit of the workers. Further, Becker discussed the role of government. The government intervention in combating discrimination is quite important. So, he acknowledged that this anti-discrimination laws and policies may have a role to play in reducing discrimination, but he cautions against this excessive regulation that could impose unintended costs or distortion in the labor market. So, too much of regulation in the form of certain laws may create some kind of imbalances in the market. So, instead going for any kind of government intervention, Becker emphasizes that the ecosystem has to be promoted in such a way that the competition will come out, and this competition will reduce the barriers to entry in order to foster equal opportunities for all the individuals. So, rather than going for too much of government intervention and strict regulations, the economies should move towards promoting competitive environment, which will reduce the barrier to some kind of creating discrimination. So, overall the economics of discrimination represents a pioneering effort to apply economic principles to the study of social phenomena, challenging this conventional wisdom and providing a framework for understanding the economic causes and consequences of discrimination. We have already discussed about what are the consequences of a discrimination in the labor market. So, over the period of time, Becker's analysis on this economics of discrimination has been subject to the criticism and certain refinements over these years. So, his work continues to be influential in shaping research and policy debates on discrimination and inequalities over the period of time. Certain modifications has been done and certain criticisms has been also taken into consideration over the period of time, but the core understanding about this economics of discrimination is there in the form of human capital theories, in the form of taste based discrimination, and the economic environment leading towards competition, which will lead to lower the discrimination in the labor market. While talking about discrimination, happens in the labor market in terms of its outcome in terms of wage and employment. So, Becker's theory of labor market discrimination is based on the concepts of like taste discrimination, the discrimination coefficient. Further, Becker argued about the employers discrimination, employees discrimination, and in the form of sometimes it is customers discrimination. Let us try to understand the Becker's theory of labor market discrimination, which is based on the concept of taste discrimination. This concept essentially translates the notion of racial biases or prejudice into the language of economics. Let us take for example, suppose there are two types of workers in the labor market, while one group is the white workers and the other is the black workers. So, a competitive employer faces a constant price for these two inputs, like let us say WW is the wage rate for the white workers and WB is the wage rate for the black workers. So, these are their respective input prices, and if the employer is biased against blacks, so the employer gets disutility from hiring black workers, which means even though it costs only WB dollars to hire one person hour of black labor, the employer will act as if the cost is WB whole into 1 plus D dollar, where this D is a positive number and it is called the discrimination coefficient. So, in effect, the racial bias blinds this employer to the true monetary cost of the transaction. The transaction happens in that form that the employers perceive the cost of hiring this black, it exceeds actual the cost. Suppose the wage rate for the black workers, let us say it is $10 per hour, and the discrimination coefficient let us say is 0.5. So, the employer will then act as if hiring the black worker costs $15 per hour. So, there is 50% increase in the cost. So, the racial bias blinds the employer to the true cost. Actual cost is $10 because the firm is going to have some kind of biasness and the discrimination coefficient is 0.5. The perceived cost is going to be $15 per hour. So, the discrimination coefficient D gives the percentage markup in the cost of hiring a black worker, which will be attributable towards the employer's prejudice. Now, if the discrimination coefficient is higher, the greater is the prejudice. So, the firm will have greater disutility from hiring these blacks, and the greater is the discrimination coefficient. So, some employers, it may happen that they are the black owned firms and they might have a different type of prejudice, biasness. They prefer to hire blacks. So, if some employers they prefer to hire blacks, now this type of behavior of the firm is called the nepotism. This nepotism implies that an employer when is going to adjust its utility cost of hiring a favored worker. Now, this utility adjusted cost is going to be, let us say for the black worker is going to be WB into 1 minus N dollar, where the N is the nepotism coefficient and this N is positive number. So, if these black employers prefer to hire black workers, they will act as if hiring a black worker is cheaper than its actual cost. So, the economic transaction is going to be different in case of a firm who is having nepotism. So, the actual cost is going to be let us say $10 for hiring a black worker for 1 hour, but this N is going to be let us say 0.5, then the perceived cost by the firm is going to be $5 per hour. So, in that case the perceived cost is going to be less than the actual cost. So, it is easy to apply this Becker's definition of this taste discrimination to other types of economic interactions, like it is employees discrimination. So, what we discussed so far is the employers discrimination. So, we can apply this employees discrimination to the customers discrimination. Now, let us say if the white workers, for instance, they dislike working alongside with the black workers, and white customers might dislike purchasing goods and services from the black sellers. So, if a prejudice or bias to white workers wage is equals to WW, he will act as if his wage is equals to WW into 1 minus D, where D is a positive number. Now, if he has to work alongside with the black workers, then he is going to perceive the wage rate, it is as if WW into 1 minus D. So, the white worker then perceives and he takes home the pay which is going to be less than the actual one. Similarly, we can describe this customers discrimination. Now, if a prejudiced white customer purchases a goods from a black seller, he acts as if the price of the good is not equal to the price what it actually, but he perceives that the price is, let us say, P into 1 plus D. This D is discrimination coefficient, which is a positive number. So, the discrimination coefficient monetizes this biasness, this prejudice, regardless of whether the source of this prejudice is whether it is employer, which leads to sometimes employers discrimination, whether the source of this biasness is the employee, which may lead to employees discrimination, or the source of the discrimination or the prejudice is from the customer side, which leads to customers discrimination. So, there could be employers discrimination, there could be employees discrimination, there could be customers discrimination, which can be measured in terms of this discrimination of coefficient. So, one can interpret this Becker's definition of taste discrimination in terms of the theory of compensating differential. We have already discussed about this compensating differential, what exactly the theory of compensating differential talks about. If you remember, the theory of compensating differential is based on the idea that the person considers the whole of the advantage and disadvantage of an economic exchange. So, it is the whole of the advantages and disadvantages. So, a biased person incorporates this race, national origin and the gender of the market participants in the long list of advantage and disadvantage that influence the value of the exchange. So, when they go for an economic exchange, they take into consideration these characteristics into advantage and disadvantage. Now, the labor market will have to generate some compensating differential to compensate the biased person for their utility loss or the gain while taking into consideration these characteristics. So, while taking into consideration these characteristics, the players in the market, they have certain kind of advantage and disadvantage in terms of their outcomes. So, those outcomes has to be compensated in terms of the wages or the price. To understand this taste based discrimination, how it happens in case of employers case, let us try to understand with an example. Suppose there are two types of workers in the labor market, as we said, white and black workers, and consider a competitive farm which is deciding that how much of these two inputs to be higher. So, we assume that black and white workers, they are perfectly substitute in this production. So, we can write the production function like output is a function of number of white workers employed plus number of black workers employed. So, we can write this production function that output Q is a function of number of white workers employed and number of black workers employed. So, here we are considering that we are ignoring the role of capital, we are only considering that this production function is having two inputs and they are black workers and white workers. Both these black workers and the white workers, they are perfectly substitute to each other. It is important to note that this farm's output depends on the total number of workers hired, regardless of whether they are black and white, which means the farm gets the same output if it hires 50 white workers and 50 black workers, or if it is going to hire 100 white workers and no black workers, the output is going to same, or the farm can have a combination of 100 black workers and no white workers. So, any possible combination of these black and white workers is going to give the farm a fixed level of output. So, as a result, the output produced by hiring one more worker or the marginal product of labor is same regardless of whether the farm hires a black worker or it hires a white worker. Now, we have considered that this black and white workers, they are both perfectly substitute, which means they are equally productive. So, any differences that arise in the economic status of these two groups cannot be attributed to their skill differential. It must come from the discriminatory behavior of the market participants, hence it comes from the employer. So, as I said, we have simply ignored the role of capital in the process of production. We have considered only two factor inputs, they are the black workers and the white workers. Now, before introducing this employer's biasness into the analysis, let us first review the hiring decision of a firm that does not discriminate. It is a color blind firm. It does not discriminate whether it is they are having a black workers or white workers. So, the color blind firm faces a constant input price like WW for the white workers and WB for the black workers respectively. Now, because both groups of the workers have the same value of marginal product, so a non-discriminatory firm will hire whichever group is cheaper. So, if the market wage for the black workers were below the market wage of the white workers, then the firm would hire only black workers. Now, if the wage rate of the white workers is less than the wage rate of black workers, then the firm will hire only white workers. So, a firm is non-discriminatory and he is completely guided by the value of marginal product of labor while hiring any worker. Now, suppose the market determined wage of the black worker is less than the market determined wage of the white workers, which means WB is less than WW. Wage rate for the black workers is less than the wage rate of the white workers. Let us assume that. So, a firm that does not discriminate between this black and white will hire the black workers up to the point where the black workers wage equals to the value of marginal product of their labor. So, in that case, you can see that how many workers the firm should hire in case of a non-discriminatory firm. So, we have taken the production function which output is a function of both number of white workers and the number of black workers, and the wage rate of black workers is less than the wage rate of white workers. So, in that case, the firm is going to hire only black workers and the market going wage rate. If you look at this graph, on the y axis we have taken employment, on the x axis we have taken wage, and the market determined wage rate for the black workers is WB, and the firm is guided by the value of marginal product of labor which is downward sloping. So, the firm's hiring decision is at point A, corresponding to that the firm is going to hire E star WB amount of black workers to maximize profit. So, this is the hiring decision of a non-discriminatory firm, and the firm is guided by the principle, profit maximizing principle, where the wage rate equals to the value of marginal product of labor. Now, let us consider the hiring decision of a discriminatory firm. So, the employer going to discriminate in terms of the color. Now, the employer acts as if the black wage is not WB. The employer is considering the black wage is WB into 1 plus D, where D is the discrimination coefficient. So, definitely the hiring decision of the firm is going to change. Now, the employer's hiring decision is not based on the comparison between WW and WB. Now, the firm is going to compare between WW and WB into 1 plus D. So, the employer will then hire whichever input has lower utility adjusted price. So, as a result, the decision rule for an employer that discriminates against the black is going to change. So, if it is a discriminatory firm, now the earlier the wage rate for the black was WB and the wage rate for the white was WW. So, a non-discriminatory firm was comparing with this WB and WW, but a discriminatory firm is going to compare this between this WB into 1 plus D and WW, because this is the utility adjusted price to hire a black worker. Now, the firm is going to hire only black workers if this WB into 1 plus D is less than WW, and if this WB into 1 plus D is greater than this WW, then the firm is going to hire white workers only. So, the hiring decision is now going to be compared between this WB 1 plus D and WW. So, as long as the black and white workers are perfectly substitute, the firm have a segregated workforce. One is black one, another one is the white one. So, as a result, you will find in the market there will be two types of firms. Those that hire an all white workforce, which for convenience we call, let us say, white firms, and those that hires all black workforce, we can call them as black firms. So, the race of the firm's workforce depends on the magnitude of the employer's discrimination coefficient, this D. So, employer who have a little biasness and have a small discrimination coefficient, they will have only black workers. However, the employers, those who have a large biasness, they are very prejudiced and they will have a large discrimination coefficient, they will only hire white workers. Now, you can see there are only two firms, the firms those who are going to hire black workers, the firms those who are going to hire white workers. Now, the hiring decision is based on this WB 1 plus D and WW. So, there are two firms, one is the white firms, the degree of discrimination coefficient is quite high. So, they are going to hire only white workers, they are going to pay the W wage rate and they are going to hire E star W amount of white workers. Now, had it been a situation in a non-discriminatory farm, then the amount of workers would have been hired at the wage rate WB and E star B amount of workers would have been hired. So, when we see the degree of coefficient is small, let us say this D0. So, a black farm, the farm is still hiring black workers because this wage rate is WB into 1 plus D0, the coefficient is small, but the number of employment is less. Let us say for another farm, the discrimination coefficient is D1, he is hiring black workers, but again the number is reduced to E1B. So, if this discrimination coefficient increases, the number of hiring black workers is going to be reduced. So, it depends on that the degree of the discrimination coefficient decides that how many of black workers are going to be hired by the black farm. So, as we have seen, the white farm hires workers up to the point where the wage of the white workers equals to the value of marginal product, or its W equals to the value of marginal product of labor, which is downward sloping. We are assuming that the white wage, it exceeds the black wage. So, the white farm therefore is paying excessively high price for its workers and hires relatively fewer workers, which is E star W. So, employers who dislike black workers sufficiently, they are not only hiring all white workforce, but also they are hiring relatively few white workforce, because the wage, the cost of hiring the white workers is high. So, as a result, the distribution is going to be inefficient. They are paying high wage rate, so the cost is going to high. They are hiring less number of workers. If you look at the black farm, the black farm will tend to hire too few workers. So, as I said, had it been a situation the farm would have been a non-discriminatory farm, then the farm would have hired E star B amount of black workers with a going wage rate W star B. But the farm is a discriminatory farm. So, the discrimination coefficient, let us say farm A, it is D0. So, the price for the black worker is going to be WB into 1 plus D0. So, the discrimination coefficient in this case is small enough that the farm will still want to hire black workforce. Now, we are going to increase the discriminatory coefficient. If the coefficient in value increases from D0 to D1, then the farm is going to hire less amount of black workers at the cost of WB into 1 plus D1. So, the number of black workers hired therefore is smaller for the farms that have having larger discrimination coefficient. Because the employers do not like hiring black workers, they minimize their discomfort by hiring fewer blacks. So, in summary, we can say that the test discrimination affects the employer's hiring decision, because this biased prejudice blinds the employers to the true monetary value associated with hiring a particular worker. So, the employer is biased and he is having a perceived cost to hire the workers of a particular race. So, they are not going with the true monetary value, they are going with the perceived monetary value. So, an employer who discriminates will act as if the cost of hiring a black worker or female worker exceeds the actual cost. So, therefore, they are going with some kind of discrimination. In our next lecture, we will discuss about the discrimination and the profits of a firm, the impacts of discrimination on labor market outcomes, how different measures, different methods are used to measure this wage discrimination in the labor market. Thank you.